In the beginning, there was nothing. No light, no darkness, no time, no form, only an infinite expanse of potential waiting to be realized. From this primordial void emerged two fundamental forces: Anu, the shining diamond, embodiment of all that was good and harmonious, and Tathamet, the seven-headed dragon, embodiment of all that was chaotic and corrupt. They were not created, they simply were, opposite poles of a reality that had not yet learned to distinguish between creation and destruction. For eons beyond counting, Anu and Tathamet waged war in the darkness. Their conflict was not like the wars of mortals, with armies and strategies and treaties. It was a war of essence, each force striving to overcome the other, to define reality according to its own nature. The struggle was absolute, neither side able to gain a lasting advantage, neither willing to surrender. They were locked in an embrace that was also a mutual annihilation. When at last they struck each other with sufficient force to end the conflict, the result was not victory for either side. It was the birth of everything. Anu's crystalline form shattered, and from its fragments arose the crystal arch, the foundation of the high heavens, and the Anguirus Council, 5 beings of pure virtue who would become the archangels of the celestial host. Tathamet's body decayed and became the burning hells, a realm of fire and corruption, and from her 7 heads arose the prime evil, 3 brothers of immense power who would rule the demonic legions for all eternity. These 3 were Diablo, the Lord of Terror, whose very presence could reduce the bravest warrior to a quivering wreck; Mephisto, the Lord of Hatred, whose cold intellect could unravel the bonds of loyalty and love that held civilizations together; and Baal, the Lord of Destruction, whose rage was a force of nature, capable of reducing mountains to rubble and cities to ash. The prime evil were not merely powerful demons. They were fundamental forces given consciousness, aspects of corruption given will and purpose. Terror, hatred, and destruction were not just their domains, they were their essence. Wherever fear took root in a mortal heart, Diablo's power grew. Wherever hatred poisoned a relationship or a community, Mephisto fed. Wherever destruction raged, whether by war or natural disaster, Baal's strength increased. They were parasites on the fabric of existence, growing stronger from the suffering of others. Between the high heavens and the burning hells lay sanctuary, a world created not by the eternal conflict between angels and demons, but by a small group of beings from both sides who had grown weary of the war. The most prominent among them was Lilith, daughter of Mephisto, and Inarius, an archangel who had grown disillusioned with the Anguirus Council's unending crusade. Together, they and their followers, who came to be called the Nephalem, created a hidden world, a place apart from the cosmic conflict, where beings of mixed angelic and demonic heritage could exist in peace. Sanctuary was meant to be an escape. It became something far more dangerous. The Nephalem, children of both angels and demons, possessed a potential that neither parent race could match. They could wield the powers of heaven and hell simultaneously, and their strength grew with each generation. The angels feared them, the demons coveted them, and the Nephalem themselves, unaware of their true heritage, built civilizations and fought wars and lived mortal lives of extraordinary passion and fragility. It was into this world that the prime evil turned their attention. Sanctuary, hidden though it was, represented both a threat and an opportunity. The World Stone, the artifact that had been used to create Sanctuary and that kept it hidden from both heaven and hell, also had the power to suppress the Nephilim's abilities. If the prime evil could control the World Stone, they could either enslave the Nephalem or destroy them. And if they could corrupt Sanctuary's population, they would gain an army of hybrid warriors whose power could tip the scales of the eternal conflict decisively in Hell's favour. The history of Sanctuary is, in many ways, the history of the prime evil's attempts to claim it. Each age brought a new scheme, a new invasion, a new corruption, and each age brought heroes, ordinary men and women who rose to face threats that should have been beyond them, whose courage and sacrifice held back the darkness for another generation. The first great incursion came through the Zakarum faith, the dominant religion of the Eastern Kingdoms. Mephisto, the Lord of Hatred, had been imprisoned long ago by the Haradrim, an ancient order of mages dedicated to combating the prime evil. His soul stone, the crystalline prison that held his essence, was kept in the Zakarum temple of Travinxel. But Mephisto was patient. Over centuries he whispered to the priests who guarded him, corrupting them one by one, turning their faith into fanaticism, their devotion into cruelty. By the time the corruption was complete, the entire Zakarum church had become an instrument of Mephisto's will, and the Lord of Hatred walked free once more. Diablo's path to freedom was different but no less insidious. His soul stone had been entrusted to the town of Tristram, where it was kept in a labyrinth beneath the cathedral. A young prince named Albrecht, curious and foolish, wandered into the labyrinth and found the stone. Diablo, the Lord of Terror, poured his essence into the boy, corrupting him from within, transforming his body into a vessel for demonic power. The hero who entered the cathedral to slay the demon found not a monster in chains, but a child in agony, and the darkness that poured from that corrupted child nearly consumed the entire kingdom. The hero, a warrior whose name has been lost to history, though some call him Aidan, did manage to defeat Diablo's physical form. But victory came at a terrible cost. In a moment of hubris or desperation, the hero took the soul stone and embedded it in his own flesh, believing he could contain the Lord of Terror through sheer force of will. He could not. Diablo consumed him slowly, turning him into the Dark Wanderer, a hollow shell that walked the world, spreading terror in its wake, heading east toward the desert of Lutgolain, where Baal's prison awaited. Baal, the Lord of Destruction, had been imprisoned in a soul stone of his own, hidden in the desert city of Lutgolain. The Haradrim who placed it there had been thorough, but time and corruption had weakened the seals. When the Dark Wanderer arrived and freed his brother, the combined power of two prime evil shook the foundations of the world. The desert trembled, the dead rose, the sky burned. It fell to a new generation of heroes to confront this darkness. A warrior, a sorceress, a paladin, an Amazon, a druid, a necromancer, and an assassin, each bringing their own skills, their own motivations, their own demons to face. They tracked the prime evil across Sanctuary, from the burning ruins of Tristram to the jungles of Kurast, from the deserts of Lutgolain to the gates of hell itself. In the jungles of Kurast, they found Mephisto waiting for them in the depths of the Travinxel temple. The Lord of Hatred had transformed the once beautiful city into a charnel house, its streets running with blood, its temples devoted to sacrifice and suffering. The heroes fought through corrupted priests and demonic guardians to reach Mephisto, and the battle that followed was savage. Mephisto wielded hatred like a weapon, turning the heroes' own doubts and fears against them, whispering of betrayals, real and imagined, of the futility of their quest, of the inevitability of corruption. But the heroes endured. They struck Mephisto down and destroyed his soul stone, releasing the trapped essence of the Lord of Hatred into the void. It was a victory, but a costly one. The corruption that Mephisto had spread through Kurast would take generations to heal, and the scars on the land and its people would never fully fade. From Kurast, the heroes pursued Diablo into the burning hells themselves. The Lord of Terror had shed the Dark Wanderer's body and assumed his true form, a towering figure of crimson and obsidian, crowned with horns of bone, his every movement radiating a fear so profound it could stop a heart. The heroes fought through the Hellforge, through rivers of fire and fields of bone, through legions of demons that seemed endless, to reach Diablo's sanctum. The battle with Diablo was the defining moment of an age. The Lord of Terror unleashed horrors beyond description, visions of the heroes' deepest fears made manifest, terrors drawn from the darkest corners of their minds. Some faltered, some screamed, but they held their ground, and in the end, they prevailed. Diablo fell, his soulstone shattered, his essence scattered across the burning hells. Baal was the last of the three brothers to be confronted. The Lord of Destruction had turned his attention northward, toward the mountain of Ariat, where the World Stone, the very artifact that kept Sanctuary hidden and the Nephalem's powers suppressed, was kept. Baal sought to corrupt the World Stone, to twist it into a weapon of annihilation that would destroy both Sanctuary and its inhabitants. The heroes pursued Baal through the frozen wastes of Haragath, through ancient temples and demon-infested passes, to the summit of Mount Ariat. There, in the shadow of the World Stone, they faced the Lord of Destruction in his full fury. Baal was not subtle like Mephisto, nor psychological like Diablo. He was pure, unrelenting force, a hurricane of destruction that sought to tear reality apart through sheer violence. The heroes defeated Baal, but they arrived too late to save the World Stone. The corruption had gone too deep. The Archangel Tyrael, who had guided the heroes throughout their quest, made the agonizing decision to destroy the World Stone himself, hurling his sword, Eldruin, into its heart. The resulting explosion reshaped the world. Mount Ariat was shattered, the lands around it were devastated, and the suppression that the World Stone had imposed on the Nephalem's powers was lifted, though most of Sanctuary's inhabitants were too busy surviving the aftermath to notice. The destruction of the World Stone should have been the end of the primeval's threat. With their soulstones shattered and their physical forms destroyed, the three brothers should have been reduced to powerless spirits, wandering the burning hells in impotent rage. But the primeval were not so easily diminished. In the years that followed, a new threat emerged: Belial, the Lord of Lies, and Asmodan, the Lord of Sin, two of the lesser evils who had long schemed to seize power in the absence of the primeval, launched their own invasion of Sanctuary. Belial embedded himself in the political structures of Chaldeum, the jewel of the East, corrupting its rulers and manipulating its people through deception and intrigue. Asmodan marshalled the armies of Hell and launched a direct assault on the fortress of Bastion's Keep, seeking to breach the barrier between worlds through sheer military force. A new generation of heroes rose to face these threats: a barbarian who had survived the destruction of Ariat, a wizard who defied the teachings of her order, a monk whose fists were faster than thought, a witch doctor who spoke with the spirits of the dead, a demon hunter whose family had been slaughtered by the creatures of hell, a crusader who carried the burden of a faith she was beginning to question. They defeated Belial in the streets of Chaldeum, unmasking the Lord of Lies despite his ability to assume any form, to speak any truth, to weave deception so perfect that even those who knew they were being deceived could not tell reality from illusion. They defeated Asmodan on the battlements of Bastion's Keep, confronting the Lord of Sin in the heart of his own army, cutting through waves of demons that stretched to the horizon. But the true horror came after. As the heroes returned to the town of Westmarch, they found it in flames. Adria, a witch who had aided them in their previous quests, revealed herself as a servant of Diablo. She had been manipulating events from the very beginning, guiding the heroes to destroy the soulstones, not to eliminate the primeval, but to gather their essence. Using the Black Soulstone, an artifact of immense power that she had helped create, Adria channeled the spirits of all 7 lords of hell, the 3 primeval, and the 4 lesser evils, into a single vessel. That vessel was Leah, a young woman who had travelled with the heroes, who had trusted them, who had believed she was fighting for something good. Leah was Adria's daughter, and she carried within her a heritage she did not understand, a connection to Diablo through the Dark Wanderer who had been her father. Adria sacrificed her own daughter to resurrect Diablo in a form more powerful than he had ever been. A primeval united, embodying all 7 aspects of Hell's corruption in a single body. The Diablo that emerged from Leah's suffering was something the world had never seen. He was terror and hatred and destruction and lies and sin and pain and death, all woven together into a single consciousness of incomprehensible malice. He tore open the gates of heaven itself and launched an assault on the high heavens, the first demon in history to breach the crystal arch. The heroes followed Diablo into heaven, fighting through the corrupted streets of the celestial city, past the broken bodies of angels who had stood against the primeval and fallen. They climbed to the summit of the crystal arch where Diablo waited in his unified form, towering, radiant with dark power, his 7 heads screaming a chorus of corruption that shook the foundations of reality. The battle was the most desperate the heroes had ever faced. Diablo drew upon the power of all 7 evils simultaneously, unleashing waves of terror, hatred, destruction, lies, sin, pain, and death that assaulted the heroes on every level: physical, mental, spiritual. But the heroes had something Diablo did not. They had each other. They had the bonds forged in shared hardship, in battles fought side by side, in the knowledge that they were the last line of defense between the world they loved and the darkness that sought to consume it. They prevailed. The unified Diablo was defeated, the black soulstone shattered, and the spirits of the 7 lords were scattered once more. But the victory was incomplete. The black soulstone, though broken, had contained the essences of all 7 evils, and their release was not a liberation, but a dispersal. The lords of hell were not destroyed. They were merely freed to begin their machinations anew. In the aftermath of Diablo's assault on heaven, the archangel Malthael, who had once been the aspect of wisdom, disappeared from the Anguirus council. He had been changed by the events he had witnessed. The eternal conflict between heaven and hell, the endless cycle of corruption and destruction, the persistence of evil despite every effort to contain it. These things had driven him to a conclusion that was as simple as it was terrible. The problem was not the demons. The problem was humanity. The Nephalem, the children of angels and demons, carried within them the potential for both virtue and corruption. As long as they existed, as long as the blood of both heaven and hell ran through their veins, the conflict would continue. The only solution, Malthael concluded, was to remove the variable, to destroy humanity entirely, to end the Nephalem line, and with it, the possibility of corruption. Malthael became the angel of death. He gathered to himself an army of reapers, angels who shared his philosophy, spirits of the dead who had been twisted to serve his purpose, and the corrupted souls that Diablo had scattered across the world. He took the Black Soulstone, reassembled it, and used its power to wage a war of extermination against humanity. The Reapers descended upon Westmarch, and the city fell in a single night. The dead rose from their graves, not as mindless zombies, but as instruments of Malthael's will, turning their weapons against the living. The plague of death spread across Sanctuary, consuming towns and cities, killing millions. Malthael's logic was impeccable, and his execution was flawless. He was, after all, the aspect of wisdom. He did not make mistakes, but wisdom, taken to its extreme, can become something unrecognizable. Malthael's perfect logic had led him to the conclusion that genocide was mercy, that extinction was salvation. He had become so focused on the mathematical certainty of his solution that he had forgotten what it meant to be wise, to understand that some truths cannot be reduced to equations, that some values cannot be weighed on a scale. The last heroes of Sanctuary, the Nephalem who had defeated Diablo in heaven, tracked Malthael to the Pandemonium Fortress, the ancient citadel that stood at the threshold between heaven and hell. There, in the heart of a realm where the rules of reality were suggestions rather than laws, they confronted the Angel of Death. Malthael was unlike any enemy they had faced before. He was not corrupt, not evil in the way that the primeval were evil. He was something worse, a being of absolute conviction, who believed with every fibre of his celestial being that what he was doing was right. He did not taunt the heroes or try to deceive them. He simply stated his case and attacked. The battle was apocalyptic. Malthael wielded the power of death itself, draining the life from the heroes with every strike, turning their own mortality against them. He moved between forms, shifting from a figure of terrible beauty to a spectre of absolute darkness, his scythe cutting through reality as easily as through flesh. The heroes defeated him. But the cost was staggering. Malthael's death unleashed a shockwave of necromantic energy that spread across Sanctuary, and the Black Soulstone, the repository of all 7 Lords of Hell, was shattered once more. Its fragments scattered across the world, each one carrying a seed of corruption that would, in time, grow into something monstrous. The aftermath of Malthael's assault left Sanctuary scarred in ways that went beyond the physical. Millions had died. Cities lay in ruins, the dead had risen and been put down again. The survivors were left to rebuild not just their homes, but their understanding of the world they lived in. They had learned that angels could be as dangerous as demons, that wisdom could lead to madness, and that the line between salvation and destruction was thinner than anyone had imagined. And somewhere in the burning hells, the spirits of the primeval stirred. Diablo, Mephisto, Baal. They were not dead. They could not die, not truly. They were fundamental forces, aspects of reality itself, and they were patient. They had been defeated before. They had been imprisoned before. They had always returned. The eternal conflict continued. It would always continue. That was the terrible truth at the heart of Sanctuary's existence, that the war between good and evil was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be endured. The best that mortals could hope for was to hold the line, to push back the darkness for another generation, to buy their children and their children's children a few more years of peace before the cycle began again. But there was another truth, quieter and easier to overlook. In every age, in every generation, ordinary men and women had risen to face the darkness, not because they were destined to, not because they were chosen, but because they chose to. A warrior who picked up a sword, a sorceress who opened a book, a monk who clenched his fists, a child who refused to run. The primeval were eternal, so was the human spirit, and in the end, that was enough. The fires of hell still burn, the light of heaven still shines, and somewhere between them, in the fragile, beautiful, impossible world called Sanctuary, someone is sleeping peacefully tonight, guarded by heroes they will never meet, protected by sacrifices they will never know about. Good night, but let us go back, further back, to understand the true depth of what was at stake. The creation of Sanctuary was not a simple act of rebellion. It was an act of love, and like all acts of love in a universe defined by conflict, it carried within it the seeds of tragedy. Lilith, daughter of Mephisto, had watched the eternal conflict from the heart of the burning hells for longer than mortal minds could comprehend. She had seen worlds born and destroyed, civilizations rise and fall, heroes triumph and die. She had participated in the corruption of countless souls, the invasion of countless worlds, the endless grinding machine of hell's expansion, and she had grown weary. Not weary in the way that mortals grow weary, that physical exhaustion that comes from labour or illness. This was a weariness of the soul, a fundamental fatigue that came from existing for eons in a reality that offered nothing but repetition. The same wars, the same strategies, the same victories and defeats, played out across an infinite canvas of time and space. Lilith wanted something different. She wanted something new. Inarius was an archangel of the Anguirus Council, a being of light and purpose who had spent his existence waging war against the forces of hell. He was beautiful in the way that angels are beautiful, not with the warmth of a sunset or the softness of a flower, but with the cold, geometric precision of a crystal formation, the blinding clarity of a diamond struck by light. He was devoted to his cause, unwavering in his commitment to the destruction of evil. But devotion, when it becomes routine, can curdle into something that looks very much like doubt. Inarius had fought the same battles, for the same causes, for the same length of time as Lilith, and he had arrived at a similar conclusion. The war was endless. The sides were fixed. Nothing ever changed. He began to question whether the conflict itself was the problem, whether the very structure of the eternal war was a trap that kept both angels and demons locked in a cycle of mutual destruction. They found each other in the spaces between battles, in the quiet moments when the armies rested and the dead were counted. Their love was not the passionate, consuming love of mortal stories. It was something older and stranger, a recognition of shared disillusionment, a mutual understanding that the world they inhabited was broken and that the only escape was to build something entirely new. Together, they stole the World Stone, the most powerful artifact in existence, the crystallized essence of creation itself, and used it to create a hidden world, sanctuary, a place where the rules of the eternal conflict did not apply, where beings could exist free from the demands of heaven and hell, where the children of both sides could grow and develop without the shadow of war hanging over them. Their children, the Nephalem, were something unprecedented. Born of both angel and demon, they possessed qualities of neither and the potential of both. They were stronger than their parents, more adaptable, more creative, more alive. They could wield the powers of light and darkness simultaneously, and their abilities grew with each generation, unchecked by the Worldstone's suppressive influence. This terrified both heaven and hell. The Anguirus Council, upon learning of Sanctuary's existence, debated its destruction. The Nephalem represented an unknown variable in the eternal equation, a force that could tip the balance in ways that neither side could predict or control. Tyrael, the Archangel of Justice, argued for mercy. Imperius, the Archangel of Valor, argued for annihilation. The debate was never truly resolved. It simply continued, in various forms, for millennia. Inarius, meanwhile, grew to fear his own children. The Nephalem's power was increasing, and he could not control it. In a moment that would define the relationship between parents and children for all of history, Inarius used the Worldstone to suppress the Nephalem's abilities, dimming their light, reducing them from demigods to mortals. He did this not out of malice but out of fear. Fear of what they might become, fear of what their power might attract, fear of losing the sanctuary he had built. Lilith was furious. She saw in Inarius's action not protection but betrayal, a father crippling his own children out of cowardice. Their love, which had been the foundation of Sanctuary, shattered in that moment. Inarius, unable to face Lilith's rage or his own guilt, banished her to the void, casting her out of the world they had built together. And so, Sanctuary was left in the care of a single archangel, a being of light who had grown afraid of his own creation, who had dimmed the potential of his children and cast out their mother, who now sat alone in a world that was supposed to be a paradise, but felt increasingly like a prison. The Nephalem, reduced to mortality, forgot their heritage. They built civilizations, fought wars, loved and hated, and died in the ordinary way of mortals. But the potential that Inarius had suppressed was not destroyed. It was merely dormant, waiting to be awakened. And in times of great crisis, when the darkness pressed close and the stakes were absolute, that potential would surface in individuals who rose above their mortal limitations to become something more. The Haradrim were the first organized attempt to harness this potential. Founded by Jared Kane in the wake of the Primeval's first incursion into Sanctuary, the Haradrim were an order of mages dedicated to combating the forces of hell. They were not warriors in the traditional sense. They were scholars, researchers, diplomats, and, when necessary, soldiers. They studied the nature of demons, the mechanics of soul stones, the history of the eternal conflict, and the geography of both heaven and hell. The soul stones were their greatest achievement and their greatest failure. Created by the Haradrim with the aid of the archangel Tyrael, the soul stones were designed to imprison the essences of the primeval, to contain them in crystalline prisons where they could do no harm. The stones worked for a time. Mephisto was captured and imprisoned in the Zakharum temple. Diablo was trapped beneath the cathedral of Tristram. Baal was sealed in the deserts of Lut Gholein. his stone damaged in the process of capture. But the prime evil were not passive prisoners. They were consciousnesses of immense power and patience, and they used the time of their imprisonment to plan, to scheme, to corrupt. They whispered to their guards. They planted seeds of doubt and ambition in the minds of those who came near. They waited, with the infinite patience of beings who exist outside of time, for the moment when the seals would weaken and the stones would crack. The corruption of the Zakarum faith was Mephisto's masterwork. It took centuries, but the Lord of Hatred was nothing if not patient. He began with the high priests, the men and women closest to his prison, and worked outward through the hierarchy of the church. Each corrupted priest became an agent of influence, spreading Mephisto's whispers through the network of temples and monasteries that spanned the Eastern kingdoms. The corruption was subtle at first, a slight emphasis on punishment over forgiveness in the church's teachings, a gradual shift from worship of the light to worship of authority, a growing intolerance for dissent, for questioning, for the kind of independent thought that might have recognized what was happening. By the time the corruption was complete, the Zakarum faith had become something unrecognizable, a cult of hatred disguised as a religion of love, a machine for generating suffering disguised as a path to salvation. Diablo's Corruption of Tristram was more direct, but no less devastating. The Lord of Terror did not have centuries to work with. His prison was less secure, his window of opportunity smaller. He worked through dreams and nightmares, through whispers in the dark, through the growing sense of unease that settled over the town like a fog. The cathedral, once a place of worship and community, became a place of dread. People avoided it. Children cried when they passed it. The priests who served there grew pale and hollow-eyed, as though something was feeding on them from the inside. When Prince Albrecht descended into the labyrinth beneath the cathedral, he was not seeking adventure or glory. He was running from the nightmares that had plagued him for months, visions of fire and darkness, of a presence that watched him from the shadows, that whispered his name in a voice like grinding stone. He thought the labyrinth would be an escape. Instead, it was a trap. Diablo poured himself into the boy like water into a vessel. Albrecht's body twisted and grew, his bones cracking and reforming, his skin splitting to reveal the crimson flesh beneath. His screams echoed through the labyrinth, growing deeper and more inhuman with each passing moment, until they became something that was no longer a scream at all, but a sound of pure terror that could be heard from the surface. The hero who entered the cathedral to confront this horror was not a chosen one. There was no prophecy, no divine calling, no mystical selection. He was simply a person who could not stand by while others suffered. A warrior who had come to Tristram seeking rest, and found instead a town drowning in darkness. He picked up a sword and walked into the labyrinth because someone had to, and he was there. The descent into the labyrinth was a journey through fear itself. The corridors twisted and shifted, as though the dungeon was alive and trying to disorient its visitors. The walls wept blood, the air was thick with the stench of decay. Every shadow seemed to move, every corner to conceal something that watched with hungry eyes. And beneath it all, growing stronger, with each step deeper, was the presence of Diablo. Not yet fully manifest, but already exerting his influence, turning the labyrinth into an extension of his own consciousness. The hero fought through creatures that had once been human, victims of Diablo's corruption, their bodies twisted into forms that served his purpose. He found survivors huddled in corners, their minds broken by what they had witnessed. He discovered the remains of other heroes who had ventured into the labyrinth before him, their weapons shattered, their armor rent, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. And at the bottom of the labyrinth, he found Diablo. The Lord of Terror stood in a chamber of living stone, his form towering and terrible, his eyes burning with a malice that went beyond anger or hatred to something more fundamental, a desire to destroy not just the body but the spirit, not just the person but the hope that persons could exist at all. The battle was brief and brutal. The hero was skilled, but Diablo was a force of nature, a living embodiment of fear. He attacked not just with claws and fire, but with visions, showing the hero the death of everyone he loved, the destruction of everything he valued, the futility of resistance against a power that existed before the world was made. But the hero did not break. Perhaps he was too stubborn to break. Perhaps he was too simple-minded to understand the full scope of what he faced. Perhaps his love for the people on the surface, the blacksmith who had repaired his armor, the healer who had tended his wounds, the old man who had told him stories of better days, was stronger than any terror that Diablo could conjure. Whatever the reason, he held his ground, and in the end, he struck the blow that sent Diablo back into the darkness. But he made a mistake. In the aftermath of the battle, standing over Diablo's dissolving form, the hero looked down at the soul stone that lay on the ground, the red crystal that had contained the Lord of Terror's essence. It pulsed with a light that was almost beautiful, almost inviting, and in a moment of weakness, or was it strength, he picked it up and pressed it into his own flesh. He told himself he was containing it. He told himself he was strong enough to resist Diablo's influence. He told himself that no one else could be trusted with the responsibility. But the truth was simpler and more terrible. He had been touched by Diablo's power, and some part of him, a part he did not want to acknowledge, wanted more. The corruption was slow but inevitable. Over weeks and months, the hero changed. He became withdrawn, suspicious, prone to fits of rage that seemed to come from nowhere. He began to hear whispers, not from outside but from inside, from the stone that pulsed in his flesh like a second heart. The whispers spoke of power, of purpose, of a destiny that went beyond the petty concerns of mortals. He left Tristram in the night without saying goodbye. He walked east, toward the desert, toward Baal's prison, drawn by a compulsion he could not resist and did not fully understand. Behind him, Tristram burned. The demons that Diablo's awakening had summoned swept through the town like a plague, leaving nothing but ashes and bones. The Dark Wanderer, as he came to be called, was no longer the hero who had saved Tristram. He was a vessel, a shell, a puppet dancing on strings of fire and shadow. Diablo was inside him, growing stronger, feeding on the hero's memories and emotions, using his body as a bridge between the burning hells and sanctuary. In Lut Golin, the desert city where Baal's soulstone had been hidden, the Dark Wanderer's arrival was like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples of unease spread through the city. The dead began to stir in their graves. The sun seemed dimmer, the shadows longer. And in the palace, where the city's ruler had been quietly going mad for months under Baal's distant influence, the corruption accelerated to a fever pitch. The heroes who tracked the Dark Wanderer to Lut Golin found a city on the edge of collapse. The docks were deserted. The markets were empty. The few people who remained moved through the streets with the haunted expressions of those who have seen too much and understand too little. Something terrible was happening beneath the city, in the ancient tunnels where the Haradrim had hidden Baal's prison, and everyone could feel it. When the heroes descended into those tunnels, they found that they were too late. The seals had been broken. Baal's prison was empty, and the Dark Wanderer was gone, heading east toward the jungles of Kurast, where Mephisto waited in the heart of the corrupted Zakarum faith. The pursuit of the prime evil across Sanctuary was not a straightforward chase. It was a journey through the layers of a world that was coming apart at the seams. Each step east brought the heroes deeper into territories that had been corrupted by centuries of demonic influence, where the line between human and demon had been blurred beyond recognition. In Kurast, the corruption was so pervasive that it had become the norm. The Zakarum faithful moved through the streets with the glazed eyes of the possessed, their prayers turning to chants of blood and sacrifice. The temples that had once been places of worship were now slaughterhouses, their altars running red, their walls echoing with screams that went unheard because everyone who could have heard them was already screaming. The heroes fought their way through this nightmare to the Travingskull, where Mephisto waited. The Lord of Hatred had changed since his imprisonment. He was no longer the cold, calculating intelligence that had corrupted the Zakarum faith from within. He had become something more visceral, more immediate, a being of pure malice who had absorbed so much hatred from the world around him that he had become hatred itself, a living embodiment of every cruel word, every broken promise, every act of betrayal that had ever been committed. The battle with Mephisto was fought in the ruins of a temple, surrounded by the bodies of the faithful who had served him without knowing what they served. The Lord of Hatred attacked with waves of psychic force that turned the heroes' own emotions against them, anger at what had been done to the world, grief for those who had been lost, fear of what was to come. He was, in his way, more dangerous than Diablo, because while Diablo attacked the mind with terror, Mephisto attacked the heart with hatred, and the heart was more vulnerable. But the heroes had learned something in their journey across Sanctuary. They had learned that the darkness could not be defeated by strength alone, that the corruption could not be purged by violence. It required something more, a refusal to give in to the despair that the primeval spread, a determination to keep fighting even when the odds were impossible, a belief that the world was worth saving even when it seemed determined to destroy itself. They defeated Mephisto. They shattered his soul stone, and they followed Diablo into the burning hells, where the Lord of Terror waited in his true form, freed at last from the constraints of a mortal body. The burning hells were not what the heroes had expected. They had imagined fire and brimstone, a landscape of eternal torment. What they found was worse. The hells were a reflection of Sanctuary's own corruption, a world shaped by the fears and hatreds and despair of every soul that had ever suffered. The ground was made of compressed suffering. The air was thick with the echoes of screams. The sky was a void that seemed to absorb light and hope in equal measure. Diablo's sanctum was at the heart of this realm, in a chamber that existed at the intersection of all 7 hells, where the powers of every lord converged. The Lord of Terror stood waiting for the heroes, his form shifting and changing, his 7 heads each speaking a different language of fear, his eyes burning with the accumulated terror of every nightmare that had ever been dreamed. The final battle was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a conversation, a dialogue between hope and despair, between courage and fear, between the human spirit and the darkness that sought to extinguish it. Diablo did not simply attack. He showed the heroes what they feared most. He showed them their own deaths, the deaths of those they loved, the end of everything they had fought for. He showed them a universe that was fundamentally hostile to their existence, a reality in which their struggles were meaningless and their victories temporary. The heroes listened. They acknowledged the truth in what Diablo showed them. They did not deny the darkness or pretend it did not exist. They accepted it, and they chose to fight anyway. Not because they were certain of victory, but because fighting was who they were. Not chosen ones, not prophesied heroes, but ordinary people who had decided that some things were worth fighting for, even in the dark. They struck the final blow together, and Diablo fell. The Lord of Terror, the most feared of the primeval, was defeated not by superior power or divine intervention, but by the simple, stubborn refusal of mortal beings to surrender. It was, in its way, the most profound victory in the history of Sanctuary, not because of what was defeated, but because of what it proved about the nature of those who defeated him. The world continued to turn. The seasons changed, the dead were buried, the ruins were cleared, and life, stubborn, beautiful, impossible life, went on. The primeval were diminished but not destroyed. They would return as they always did, wearing new faces, pursuing new strategies, finding new weaknesses to exploit. And when they did, new heroes would rise, not because they were chosen, but because they chose. That was the secret that the primeval could never understand, the equation that Malthael's perfect logic could never solve, the variable that Inarius's fear could never suppress. The human spirit was not a fixed quantity. It was not a resource to be depleted or a weapon to be wielded. It was a choice, made fresh in every generation, in every heart, in every moment of darkness. The choice to stand, the choice to fight, the choice to love a world that offered no guarantees, to build in the shadow of destruction, to hope in the face of despair. That choice was eternal, and as long as it was made, the darkness would never truly win. The fires of hell still burn beneath the surface of the world. The light of heaven still shines beyond the veil of the sky, and in the space between them, in the fragile and beautiful world called Sanctuary, someone is sleeping peacefully tonight, wrapped in the warmth of a choice made by heroes they will never know. Good night.